Doctors of Reddit, what was the worst reaction, happy in a psychotic way or sad, that you have ever gotten from telling someone their loved one has or will die? Story 1. Work in orthopedics. Had a car crash involving 7 family members. The youngest was a 9-year-old with open fractures to both legs. Rushed straight into the theater, but the child had developed rapid onset sepsis, mixed with some blood loss. On the table before surgery could begin properly. Despite a large number of staff, as you can imagine, we couldn't do it anymore. The father was the last to find out, as suffered a fractured skull and was moved to a different trauma hospital. A crash occurred halfway between the 2 hospitals, and patients were split up due to rush or need at the time. He had internal bleeding in the brain and was in the intensive care unit for a week. His wife didn't tell him until he left ICU, out of fear it would set him off or hinder recovery. I heard when he found out, he self-discharged and attempted I hope he's alright now and getting help, but unfortunately being in a different area, it's hard to find out. I believe it was actually his wife that was driving. Finally, as a side note, please ensure that your headrest in a car is adjusted correctly. I see a lot of head, skull, and neck injuries frequently because of this. Only today I was seeing a fractured C5 because of this. It's something you only have to do once if you're driving the same car all the time, but in combination with a seatbelt, it really is there for a reason, not just for comfort. Story 2. Intern year of residency while working on the vascular surgery service. ER pages about an older lady who was being transferred in from an outside hospital with an aortic aneurysm rupture. Aortic aneurysm ruptures have a really poor outcome, but the interesting thing is that while an individual is actively dying from it, they're still coherent and not in relatively terrible pain. About a couple minutes after me leaving the ER room, the patient died. Anyways, the daughter and best friend arrived, presumably being with her at the other facility's ER previously. I took them to a separate room away from all the hustle of the ER and let them know. Of course, they were surprised because we were just talking to her, and she didn't seem to be in that much pain. Both of these are true statements. Aortic aneurysm ruptures really are a relatively low pain way to die, but can be pretty shocking for loved ones to register in a short amount of time. Alternatively, it was the 40-something-year-old mother of 2 who had been admitted for nausea and vomiting and died of multi-system organ failure, heart attacks, strokes, ischemic colitis, pulmonary embolism, etc., because of a rare clotting disorder that decided to manifest itself at once for the first time in her. Telling a family that someone that young and previously healthy that not only is the mother going to die, but that they should have their doctor look at screening them for a rare condition is no fun. Story 3. Worked on a medical surgical for a few years at the beginning of my career as a nurse. Sure, we had a few patients here and there that were just there for observation. The first cancer patient I lost in my career seemed like one of those. When he was admitted to our floor, he was always cheerful and polite and never admitted to feeling ill in any way. One of the nicest people you could want to meet. I remember him because of this. The dude had stage 4B lung cancer and never once asked for anything. Over the course of a few months, I got to know him better. As it turns out, he thought he had a bad cold and found out he was dying shortly. It's crappy, but that's life sometimes, I suppose. It isn't always pretty. When he found out, he seemed at peace with it all. Then he began working like a madman from his bed. Every time I went into his room to check on him or give him meds, he was writing in a notebook. Only once did he receive visits while he was with us, and it was his wife, who was brought by a friend. She'd never learned to drive because she never wanted to or needed to. Dude spent his entire life taking care of her, completely and totally. As it turns out, all the writing in notebooks was him leaving her notes of how to do things. He'd literally taken care of her since they were in high school. She didn't even know how to use a dishwasher. Nothing. I think of him from time to time, and I've had a rough go with love in my life. The times I asked this man about his wife were some of the few times I saw his face light up with delight. It's nice to think that love like that exists. Story 4. I was at a delivery where both mom and baby were having problems. As we were saving the baby, the operation room team was trying to save mom. We did, and they didn't. As we were leaving with a baby to the neonatal intensive care unit, the OR doctor was telling dad and his family that his wife didn't make it. He saw his baby and asked when the mom could begin breastfeeding. Grandma fell to the floor crying, but dad just had this look like he was just waking up and not hearing what was going on. Seeing him visit the NICU is just so sad. You could see him trying to hold it all in while visiting his baby. Story 5. EMT here. I had a few of these, but the worst one I observed indirectly. We had a young woman in her 20s killed instantly in a high-speed collision. Same old story. Car versus tree, the tree won. The girl was alone in the car. Cold November night. A sad way to die. The crash was so bad that we thought we should have the car towed back to the firehouse so the FD could do the extrication behind closed doors. We figured she'd just come apart when the car was pulled away from her, but she stayed together, mostly, and they loaded her into our ambulance to go to the hospital to pronounce her. We were only basic EMTs and pronouncement wasn't in our protocols. We get to the ER and park up front, outside of the bays usually reserved for ambulances to back up into. No need to take up space with an already obviously dead patient. One of the ER docs came out to the ambulance and pronounced her there and told us to sit tight. The family was coming. Apparently all they'd been told was that their daughter had been in an accident and that they needed to get to the hospital right away. So we sat in the ambulance with a dead girl under a sheet. She was only a few years older than me, and I knew her vaguely from around town. It was weird. A pickup truck comes screaming into the ER parking lot a few minutes later, and a man and a woman about my parents' age come tumbling out before it even stops and goes running into the ER. The parents. A few minutes later, the lights in the family waiting room, which is right across the sidewalk from our ambulance, come on, and the nurse brings the parents in. We can't hear anything, but we can see the exchange. "Have a seat, please. The doctor will be right with you." She leaves and closes the door, and we see the parents alone, terrified at what's to come. The mother is wringing her hands and pacing. The father is standing stiff and stoic. This is going to be bad. We can see the doc who pronounced her coming down the hall, with a nurse and a social worker in tow. He gets to the door, hesitates a second, straightens his tie, and turns to the woman with him. We couldn't hear him, of course, but we knew he said, "Ready?" He opens the door and the parents whip around. We see him introduce himself and give a short speech. "I'm sorry to tell you this, but your daughter died at the scene of the accident." The mother melted. I'd never seen a human just dissolve like that, as her bones had suddenly turned to jelly. The father caught her before she hit the floor, and he looked like he'd been hit with a sack of cement in the gut. He doubled over but held on to her, got her to the couch, and we just sat there watching this horrible silent movie playing out in front of us. It felt crappy to intrude in their private moment, and we talked about it in the cab of the ambulance. In a way, we felt like a part of the family, at least for the short time that we took care of their daughter. We treated her body with as much respect as we could. We carefully transported her to the hospital so there would be no further damage. We kept her safe while they were en route, and we made sure she was never alone. That was nearly 40 years ago. That girl has been twice as long as she was alive. I think about her that night every once in a while, and now that I'm a father of kids about that age, it's too painful to bear. That was only one of the hundreds of accidents I responded to over my EMS and firefighting career, but it wasn't even the worst one. But it was the one that had the most impact on me, and I often wonder how that poor family coped with it. Story 6. This was 3 years ago, and I had recently started training in the hospital, and I was placed in a consultation room for a week. The doctor told me the next patient had received many treatments for her bowel cancer, but the cancer was coming back too fast. There was nothing the hospital could offer her anymore, so that day we were to tell her how she only had an estimated 3 months to live. They walked into the room, and she looked as if she already understood what we were about to say, but the husband was distraught. He was in tears, and I had to do my best to offer advice and comfort as the doctor had already gone back to his paperwork. It was one of the most harrowing experiences I've had in the hospital to date. Hearing his desperate pleas of whether there was anything we could do to help, his wife did her best to console him too, but I could see she needed the support too. "I'm really sorry I couldn't do anything to help, old friend. I hope your wife rests peacefully." Story 7. When I worked in a large inner-city ER, this family had brought in their grandmother who had gone to take a nap in the family living room on her family chair. Well, when she didn't wake up for 8 to 10 hours, the family activated emergency medical services and brought her to me. She had been dead for half the day at this point, which was very obvious, so we called it. The lady was stiff at this point. When I called the family into the room, all 20 of them, to tell them their 88-year-old without a decent organ in her body on dialysis had indeed died, they accused me first of lying, then second of murdering her. Police had to be called as a particularly boisterous 14-year-old female was being very threatening and repeating what a lot of families say. "She was fine this morning. People don't just die." Unfortunately, that is how everyone died. Story 8. In inner-city Detroit in the 80s, where I trained as a surgeon, mostly knife and gun trauma, it was common for reactions to be violent. The organ procurement nurse was beaten up when he spoke with a family member about organ donation. Another time, a family member punched and kicked dozens of holes in the walls up and down a corridor. 2 brothers, on hearing about the death of their 3rd brother, were vowing revenge. I got them to promise not to do it on a night I was on trauma call. The worst were the parents of a young man killed while committing rape. Not only did they have to deal with the loss of their son, but the circumstances of his death were terrible. Quiet shock. Your son is and was also a damn. Story 9. Best was talking with a family matriarch, strong businesswoman whose children had taken over several businesses in the town, very rich, influential family. We originally admitted her as a stroke, but on further review found multiple brain metastasis. The family wanted everything done. This was a mentally alert woman who at 94 they wanted to have chemo and surgery. I discussed her options with her, including no aggressive treatment. She was elected for this. She went into hospice and died peacefully a few months later. She asked what I would do. Having just gone through this with my grandmother and grandfather the year before I gave her both sides of the story. Doing everything and buying a few months, but dealing with surgery and illness. Or just pursuing comfort measures. I think she was happy with the decision. I think the family was upset with me for giving her that option. Story 10. The patient came in for drug OD with her boyfriend. She was stabilized, but a complication caused her to pass. We stood there for a few moments and let him have a moment. We had one of those 1,000-yard stares look on his face, and he went full rage. He got on the bed and started beating her. And when I mean beating her, I mean close-fisted punches on her face and body and kept saying, "Why? Why would you do this to me?" He called her a selfish crap and some other stuff. I can't remember because 8 to 10 people had to pull him back. He was removed from the hospital and kept screaming why. That one will always stick out to me. Story 11. I don't want to say I've seen any way someone can react because I'll see one in a month or a year I never thought I would see. A 60-plus-year-old man a few weeks ago came to the emergency department for abdominal pain and CT found a 10-centimeter mass in his pancreas. Always had a smile on his face, joked with me while he was in the hospital, thanked me and my resident team every time I was in the room, or walked by and he called me in for our help. It's amazing how some people feel a sense of calm when they try to hold back their own emotions when telling someone they likely have seen it last Christmas. Saw 6 to 7 family members in a room when Grandpa and Dad was coding take different routes. One was in the corner crying, one in the corner just staring at compressions, one trying to fight the chaplain, and one refusing to leave the bedside while screaming at Dad to live. He didn't make it. As a resident in the ICU, we had a 30-something male code around 0500. Brought him back after about 30 minutes or so. The problem was he started to code after about 30 minutes. Compressions and another round of epinephrine, and he would come back just to do it all over again. With each code overhead, the family would just stand up, walk outside, and sit on chairs they brought outside the room. No emotion, no tears. Just had this look that he came back before and will again. My attending in-house was an old Air Force crit care doc who told the family after 5 cycles of this, it was torture to continue. They disagreed. I signed out to the oncoming resident and heard they finally let him die around 1100. In my state, we have to wait 48 hours after deciding to withdraw care. After a few days, the patient's wife of 50-plus years decided to withdraw care. She couldn't help but feel she was killing her husband. He had previous surgery to remove a lung, and his one remaining lung had terrible pneumonia that wasn't improving. He went into VTAC and died 2 hours before we were to remove the tube. I had never seen a weight lifted off a family member like this, since when she told me, he knew I couldn't do it, so he did it himself. The one I will never forget is the withdrawal of care of a 17-year-old. He was driving home from football practice with his little brother and flipped his car. He had a traumatic brain injury and never regained consciousness. Brother didn't have a scratch. The dad was a mess, but then thanked us for our care and respect after about 4 days. I will never forget the hatred and the look the mom gave any medical staff in that room. I never heard her say one word. We were the team who couldn't and wouldn't save her son. She walked out when we brought up organ donation. My second branch as a resident was on a brain-dead 17-year-old, so we could see how good his lungs were for donation. The organ donation group sent me a letter a month later thanking me for my service. It stated the approximate age of each organ recipient, what organ they received, and what their hobbies are. I have the letter framed and hanging up in my house. Story 12. So here's a weird one that stuck with me. Had a patient in his 50s die in a single room in the ward while surrounded by his Portuguese family. Mostly women, wives, sisters, and in-laws, all in their 40s at least. We knew he was deteriorating and had no plans to resuscitate him if and when he died. A few days into his admission, he passes away while the family was visiting. I get called in by the nurse to confirm the death, and everyone in the room is completely silent and watching me. I confirm what they already know, and everyone just mobs me, hugging me, kissing my hands, kissing my cheeks, and thanking me profusely for looking after their relative. Not what I was expecting at all. It was like a sudden collective release of tension in the room. Somehow I think they were just relieved he wasn't suffering anymore. This is kind of beautiful in its own tragic way. Story 13. Nursing assistant. So I'm a bit down the chain of command, but still relevant. Had this Lithuanian couple come into emergency department and couldn't speak a word of English. They'd come on one last holiday before their baby came, except they were rushed straight off the plane into an ambulance as the woman had severe abdominal cramps and heavy bleeding. The doctor had to translate that the baby had died. I will honestly never forget those screams for the rest of my career. Like blood-curdling, pure heartbroken screams from both of them. Honestly, the whole day every single staff member just was so shaken and upset. It's not like we've never had people die. Hell, even kids die. But I don't know, just the sheer pure heartbreak. They were destroyed. Story 14. 28-year-old metastatic breast cancer. The wailing on the oncology ward when she was told there was no more chemo to be offered was bad. But to see the two young kids stand there, wide-eyed and not really take it in was just something else. In my first year of being a doctor and had to be counseled by the nurses that kids behave a certain way. Thank God for nurses. Also had a young guy suddenly in the toilet, a medical patient in the surgical ward. Having to call the family at 2 a.m. in the morning, then to have the 3 young kids be in absolute shock was also surreal. The nurses locked the entrance to the ward as the eldest child was 16, and they were worried she might run. Story 15. Had a patient who was flown in from far away with a non-survivable accidental burn. The only family member at the hospital was an adult child, who had a very appropriate response when I told them. Shock, disbelief, sadness, denial, etc. The patient's spouse was still at home, hours away. I called the spouse and told them about the nature of the burn, the need to get to the hospital ASAP to say goodbyes, etc. The response was, "Okay, thank you, doctor." Most people are frantic, but this person was completely calm and more concerned about getting the house cleaned up. The patient surprisingly made it through the night, and the family brought the spouse to the hospital the next morning. I was able to talk to the spouse and realized that when the patient left the house with the paramedics, the spouse knew that there was no way the patient would survive. I was just confirming what they already knew, that they were losing their partner of almost 40 years. They seemed more concerned about the house because they just couldn't bear to look at the footprints burned into the carpet anymore. Story 16. I worked in an NICU for a while as a nurse. 2 things regarding death I will never forget. One of them was a preterm baby who had been doing pretty well, but in the middle of the night, things started to go bad. We ended up coding him and he did not make it. The parents were called, and as the mom entered the nursery and turned the corner to see his bed, she started screaming and collapsed on the floor. It was heartbreaking. Another similar situation, but the parents were present as the baby had not been doing well all day. After the baby passed, the parents called family members to come to visit. 2 grandparents entered the unit. A grandmother followed directly by the grandfather. This man had his head down with a look of complete heartbreak on his face and was just shuffling almost lifelessly behind his wife. After he entered the bereavement room, the entire nursing staff started bawling their eyes out. It was one of the saddest moments of my nursing career. Story 17. Being blamed. This lady was visiting the area with her friends when she began having heavy bleeding. I told the patient that it is always concerning when postmenopausal women have bleeding. Furthermore, she had copious necrotic tumors falling out of her uterus as well. I told her that until the pathologist looks at it under the microscope, we won't know for sure, but this is concerning for cancer. Long story short, it takes days for the final read to come back, but she stabilized and went home in the meantime. Unfortunately, the pathology came back as a rare and aggressive form of cancer. I was no longer involved in her care, but was sorry to hear about the diagnosis. As a courtesy, I called her to make sure she had all the information and had what she needed before going to see the gynecologist. She tells me, "Oh, I thought you were calling to apologize. I'll never forget you telling me that you think I have cancer. It's part of the stages of grief, denial, anger, etc. But still it hurt that I went out of my way to check in on her, and she responded with so much anger and blame. True, until we have a diagnosis, we can't say if it is X or Y, which I told her, but we owe it to the patients when we have a serious concern that we have to share that info with them. Anything less is unethical." Story 18. When I was a pediatric resident working in the neonatal intensive care unit, a set of twins was delivered way too early. The parents had already given names to twin A and twin B. They both survived delivery, but twin B died overnight. When we broke the terrible news to them, they were appropriately devastated. But the thing that always struck me as weird is what they did next. They decided to switch names so that the twin that lived had the name they liked more. I often think back on the twin that died and how sad that all was. Story 19. ER doc here. Told the wife her husband had a huge hemorrhagic stroke, unlikely to wake up. Screams, sobs, collapsing. Then crushing chest pains. Now she's my patient too. Troponin, echo, and cardiac catheterization showed she developed Takotsubo cardiomyopathy, aka broken heart syndrome, right in front of me. Story 20. A father who just found out his son had died from an overdose calmly went and sat in one of our empty ER rooms. He told the registered nurse to admit him because, "If I go home tonight, the family will have 2 funerals to plan." After a mandatory 72-hour hold in psych, he was released with a few new meds, which he used to kill himself.